Hello, I'm Mia from Art Is In You, and today I'm going to show you how to do a silkscreen on tissue paper and then how to transfer it to a painted pottery piece. So if you already have a silkscreen on tissue paper, you can just skip the first half of this video and I'll show you how to put it onto the piece of pottery. But if you're starting just with tissue paper and a silkscreen stencil, then I'll show you how to do it now. So cut a piece of tissue paper that's slightly larger than your stencil, and then lay your stencil on it the opposite way you want it to be after you put it on your pottery. So backwards, more or less. And then I'm gonna do mine in black. So I'm gonna put a little black paint on my palette, and just as a heads up, dark colors show up better over light colors than light colors do over dark colors. So it would be a good idea to do a lighter background and a darker colored stencil. Oh, for other supplies, I have water for washing my brushes, paper towels, and paintbrushes, and I also have the silkscreen powder, as well as my stencil tissue paper, and I'm going to put my stencil on a plate. And I have two other colors of paint as well that I will use for my background. So I put a little bit of black paint on my palette, which I'm just using a plastic lid. You can use a tile or whatever works for you. But I'm going to put a tiny bit of this powder in the palm of my hand, and then take a pinch of it and sprinkle it on my black paint. And then quick put this back. So this powder is going to make our paint thicker so that it doesn't run underneath the stencil. So I'm going to mix it with the end of my paintbrush, and it's going to end up being about the consistency of creamy peanut butter. It's a lot thicker than it was, but I think I'm going to add just a tiny bit more powder. Just do it a little bit at a time, because if you add too much, then you'll have to add more paint, and then you have to remix the whole thing. So you're just going for kind of creamy peanut butter. So it stays on my brush, but it's not so hard that I won't be able to use it. So the next thing we're going to do is take this thickened paint, and I'm going to get some on the tip of my finger. So when you're doing it on tissue paper, it's a good idea to use more on your finger than you would if you're just doing it on pottery, because it will stick to the tissue paper better. So now I'm just going to use my finger and the paint on it and rub gently in a circle from the middle out onto the tissue paper. Keep quite a bit of paint on your finger and do not press very hard. Gently rub, but rub on it enough that the paint will go through the stencil. So gently press on it, but do not push. And just go as quickly as you're able. And just make sure you fill in all of the stencil. Some silkscreen stencils might look different than this. Some will be colored so that you can see the design, but others won't be. Okay, I think I've covered most of it. So I'm gently going to lift it up and peel it off. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So I'm going to take my stencil and place it directly in water a minute and let my tissue paper dry. Just keep it laying flat. Okay, so while my tissue paper dries, we're going to go on to the next step. If you already have your stencil, just set it aside for this step. Okay, so I'm going to take my piece of pottery that I'm going to be putting my stencil on, and I'm going to paint 3 coats of a base color, the color I want to be behind my stencil. Silkscreen stencils are easier to put on smoother, flatter surfaces like a plate or the outside of a mug. If you do something that is concave, like a bowl or a small dish, it might be more difficult to make your stencil work because you're bending it. Okay, so I'm going to set this aside and use my large brush to paint 3 coats of my base color. I'm using light colors so that my black stencil will show up. So we're going to paint the first 2 coats and let them dry completely, and then we're going to paint the last coat and put the stencil right on. So just paint the first 2 coats, and then we'll do the last coat and the stencil at the same time. Alright, so I have painted my first 2 coats of my colored paint on my plate, and it is all the way dry, the first 2 coats, as well as my stencil. It's also dry. So on this I did kind of an ombre. As you can see, I did purple and then blue in the middle. The only thing you have to be careful with if you do something like that is that for your last coat, it still has to be wet when you put your stencil on. So it's a little bit harder to paint it fast enough doing that and keep it wet. So just as a thing to keep in mind, it's easier to do it if you do just one color, but if you do something like that, then you have to be quick and make sure it's all wet at the same time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and do my final coat. So I'm going to start on the outside and move to the middle because I want the middle to be the wettest, because that's where my stencil is going to be. So I'm going to do my last coat as fast as I can and keep it all wet. And as soon as I'm done painting that coat, I'm going to put my stencil down on it and then press it down gently into the wet paint. Okay, I'm going to make sure that it's all quite wet and smooth here. Alright, and now I'm going to take my stencil and flip it so the paint side is down and do my best to center it. Okay, then I'm going to start in the middle and slowly move it out. Just kind of pat it with your fingers into the wet paint. And once you've done that, if your paint is wet enough, your stencil should show up very clearly through the paper. So now you just have to let it dry all the way. If you're in a hurry, you can use a blow dryer to dry it more quickly. Otherwise, just let it sit and air dry. And while you're doing that, you could paint the back or add little details or whatever you want to do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and let mine dry and paint some of the back, and then I'll show you what it looks like when we peel it off. Alright, so my silkscreen tissue paper has dried all the way. I did use a blow dryer, but you do have to be careful when you're waiting for this to dry, because not only the top piece has to dry, but the paint under it has to dry too. Because if it's not all dry, then if you peel it off, it'll peel off the paint under it instead of leaving the stencil behind. So one of the safest ways to make sure you have it totally dry is to just let it sit for a few hours, or even overnight. And that will surely make it dry all the way. But another way, before you peel it off all the way, just check a couple different corners of your stencil. And if they start peeling off and leave a clear image behind without any holes in it or anything, then you know it's dry enough on those edges. So mine is dry all the way, so I'm just going to slowly peel it off. And if you start testing it like this and it starts peeling off some of the paint underneath instead of leaving behind the stencil, then all you have to do is lay it back down and take a tiny bit of water on the tip of your finger and just press it onto the area that was peeling off, and then let it dry again. So I'm just going to super gently peel this off. And it does stick pretty hard, so just peel slowly and gently so that you don't tear your paper. And it's normal for it to leave behind a little bit on the paper. So I just kind of work from all directions into the middle. If your paper starts ripping a little bit, little areas, just lift that little piece off. Separately. And there we are. So I just have a couple other small pieces of tissue paper that ripped off that I'm going to quick peel off. If you can't get them off, gently use a toothpick to scratch at it until an end folds up. Alright, so that's how it looks. So now you're finished with the stencil part. So if there's any major mess ups, or say there was kind of a hole in my bird's face that didn't stick down when I pulled it off, and I didn't notice until too late, then you can use your paint to touch it up also with a toothpick or a paintbrush. So now all you have to do is finish any other things you're going to do to your piece, and then you're all finished. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you learned a lot. We'll see you next time.